Now, the larger tendencies in globalisation, such as the slowdown in world market development that I discussed at the opening, shape the environment in which Brexit and the other developments in the UK are occurring. Now, in this paper, I'll focus on the UK and leave the larger terrain of the Commonwealth for Joanna's keynote. Now, it's fair to say that the UK was always ambivalent about Europe. To the extent that the country ever had a single mind on the matter, it was ambivalent. As you know, the British polity is different to those of the key continental countries in some ways. No written constitution, a winner-take-all political system, more developed financial and housing markets, a less regulated labour market, and a modest social policy net. And in relation to European identity itself, the gut feeling. I mean, the UK attitude to Europe was and is transactional rather than existential. The primary reason for EEC and then EU membership was the economic benefits. The sensible centre of British politics took the view that essentially we can take the benefits of EU membership without becoming European. Now, it's also clear that in part of the popular mind, and in some elite circles also, the imperial past has proved too compelling and still too recent to entirely put away. With the nation perpetually half in and half out, an exit referendum was always a possibility. European identity is more strongly established among young people than their predecessors, partly because they are an unambiguously post-imperial generation, and partly because of the formative effects of higher education. In fact, can you just step back a tiny bit? Is that happening? Is that shadow coming from? Yeah. Yeah. The UK, in fact, the two exceptions really to the half in and half out syndrome were the financial services sector and higher education and research. Now, in both of these domains, the integration into Europe has been more profound than in the country as a whole. EU students in the UK pay the same fees as UK students and likewise access income contingent tuition loans repayable after graduation, though they don't access the system of loans for living support. Now, in STEM, especially in certain universities, the EU student presence in doctoral education is much larger than the overall EU proportion of 13.3% of all research students. But the main forms of Europeanisation which are now playing out for us are academic staffing and the European Research Area programs. The quality of UK universities rests partly on non-UK EU citizen staff. More than a quarter of all staff in the leading research universities and closer to half of recent academic appointments in the Russell Group. In my own research centre, 7 of the 8 recently appointed postdocs appointed from highly competitive fields are non-UK EU citizens. Free movement has worked greatly in the UK's favour. There is little evident support for a preference for nationals, at least in the higher education sector. It's inconceivable that this vast talent pool will be sustained if the draft migration policy, which we saw leaked 2 days ago, is applied after Brexit. Appointment spans of several years cannot compare with open entry without limit, with the enticing prospect of being able to choose where one might choose to live in the long term. And the proposed regime will drive many present EU residents working in higher education back to the continent. The best researchers, of course, always have the best opportunities to leave. The UK has 0.9% of the world's population. It accounts for 3.2% of global R&D spending, which is only the 7th largest R&D resource bank in the world, 7th largest. But it publishes 9.5% of all downloaded papers and 15.9% of the most highly cited papers. As you know, it is second to the US in the number of top 20, top 50 and top 100 research universities using reputable output measures. I believe that this can be put down to a combination of 4 factors: inherited intellectual traditions and resources, Concentration, successful concentration policy via the successive RAE and REF rounds, the relatively strong financial management of British universities, the capacity to get a lot out of a moderate level of financing, and the engagement in Europe. In Europe, the UK leverages its competitive starting position to secure 63% more from Horizon 2020 and the other grants than it contributes in financial terms. In turn, UK universities leverage the larger European pool of ideas and talent to maintain the UK's global position. A great success for the UK in transactional terms. But for Europe and the UK research and universities, the benefits are also existential and sustain a great global research effort on a cooperative basis. At the same time, the UK's level of dependence on Europe is now very high. Both the dependence of some largely teaching universities on EU students and the dependence of the Russell Group on research income. The extent of European funding is also obvious at the discipline level. The largest quantity of money flows to medicine and engineering, as the table shows, but the proportionate weight of Europe is greatest in the neglected domains in the UK, such as archaeology, where 38% of funding comes from Europe, philosophy, 25%, languages, 24%. Amongst the STEM disciplines, the only one that's got a very large proportion from Europe is chemistry, with 22%. In the June 2016 referendum, the sector as a whole remained strongly opposed to Brexit. The vote for Remain in some university towns was 80%. However, in the North and the Midlands, this did not necessarily translate into the regions near the universities. Except for those local businesses that are directly fed by higher education, the benefits of European students, EU origin staff, and European publicly funded research were not self-evident, especially for older voters with no connection to higher education. But arguably, Brexit was less about net economic benefit and more about identity and control. Since 2008, average pay in the UK has dropped by 7%, and in many areas local public services have been slashed. The recent social attitude survey found that there was strong majority support for ending austerity, and 48% now favour higher taxes as well as higher spending. The first time since 2006 that the number who favour higher taxes and spending outweigh those who would like to maintain the present level of taxes or reduce taxes. It's fair to say that the growing income inequality that no English-speaking country seems able to address effectively, the economic immiseration of parts of the country, the underemployment, austerity programs themselves have helped to drive Brexit. The problem for us is that many people's answer to their problems in the political economy was not to demand a redistribution of income. Expectations were low and they saw no prospect of that happening, but rather a nativist revolt, a sort of echo of the peasants' revolt, a claim to popular power, which a heady brew which once tasted is hard to set aside, hard to reverse. And now that's happened, we can't simply wind back to where we were. Putting the genie back in the bottle requires not just a more social democratic approach to policy of the type that, say, a Labor Party might offer, but also the reopening of tolerance, inclusion and regional identity, and the pathway to that is not yet clear. In the outcome, higher education and research are casual collateral damage of the larger issues entailed in national identity and Brexit. No one really wanted that damage to occur. But for most people voting in the referendum, it was at best a third-order issue. Now, exactly what will happen in higher education and research is not yet clear. The government is strongly committed to continued UK membership of the European research programs. It knows what's at stake. And it wants to stay in the paper released yesterday, it announced that it wants to stay in as a full member, but from outside the EU itself. It's hard to see exactly how this would happen. Under all of the possible scenarios for Brexit, in which the UK abandons commitment to freedom of movement and blocks the continuation of the present residency rights for EU nationals in the UK, there would be not enough motivation for EU member countries to support more than a very limited UK participation in the European research area, regardless of UK undertakings to continue to pay its share of EU research program funding. In other words, you can't entirely separate the research schemes from the overall relationship with the EU. The bottom line for Europe is that Europe itself is at risk if the UK can cherry-pick the bits of Europe that it likes and remove itself from the obligations that it doesn't want. Aside from the core questions of EU membership, for UK higher education, the other casualty of the political environment has been non-EU student policy and regulation. Now, by commercialising international education, as you know, the UK has created a major export industry, one that also provides for rights of global mobility, albeit differentiated significantly by capacity to pay, and generates national and global public good benefits through diverse engagement in more cosmopolitan universities. However, the migration resistance in the electorate, evident in the referendum, has prompted the Prime Minister to foreshadow a major reduction in net migration, and this is difficult to achieve in relation to business migration and family reunion. So international students who are temporary migrants according to the classification, but they're part of the migration count, then come into consideration. And the Prime Minister has left international students in the net migration count against every pressure to the contrary, even from within the Cabinet, because they are the easiest category to cut when the cut becomes essential. A reduction of 30 to 40% in non-EU international student numbers has been on the table for a year, which would, of course, substantially reduce institutional incomes, especially amongst lesser status providers. Now, this cut is yet to be implemented, but the regulation of student visas has become more unfriendly, and postgraduate work rights have been largely closed up. The Home Office long supported this stance with data on international departures that implied there was a high rate of overstay by graduates. Figures like 100,000 a year have been bandied about. There's more than one kind of fake news in the world. These data were recently revised, and the government now acknowledges that at least 97% of graduates depart on schedule, so problem solved. But the government is yet to remove international students from the migration count. The total number of non-EU students in 2015-16 was 310,575, down slightly from the previous year, and just 2.6% above the level 5 years before in 2011-12. Now, if it wasn't for China and Hong Kong SAR, there would have been a substantial drop in numbers overall, with the numbers in India still well down. And this has happened in the UK while Australian education exports have returned to very rapid growth of the sort of 12 to 15% kind that we saw in the earlier period of Australian development, and Canada, in a slower, inexorable fashion, has become a bigger and bigger player in international student flows. On the other hand, the volume of wholly offshore UK international students, where migration politics are not at play, has increased from 571,000 in 2011-12 to 701,000 5 years later, 2015-16, in the last count. That's a growth of 23% in offshore international students, while very little change onshore. Other issues at play in UK higher education would normally occupy frontal attention if not for the all-consuming problems of Brexit, migration and international student flows. The Labor Party's near win in the recent election was partly driven by its promise to restore free higher education, which mobilised young people on a massive scale, a development which has led the New Zealand Labor Party to make the same promise prior to its next national election. It's hard to envision in the UK the complete abolition of domestic tuition, but at the least, the present settings of the income contingent tuition loan scheme have been destabilised. There is talk on the government side as well as the Labor Party side of revisiting fee levels and loan arrangements. Now, if so, the resulting fiscal pressures might lead the government to pull back a bit on its relatively generous subsidy for new private providers, the new challenges, as the government calls it. The introduction of the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEF, is an important global development because the approach is likely to be imitated elsewhere. However, the UK has not cracked the problem of comparative measures of teaching quality or learning achievement across disciplines and between institutions, not yet anyway. The measures being used here are proxies for teaching: employability, employment rates and graduate salaries, and student satisfaction survey results. The effect is to lock the higher education sector closer to the expectation that universities and colleges, and not family, social and cultural capital or macroeconomic policy, carries the main responsibilities for graduate outcomes. But that is a common problem for higher education everywhere. More obligations and responsibilities than direct social power and economic resources, and that happens in Europe too. So I'll hand over to Pedro.
Thank you so much, Simon. And before we hand over to Pedro, we might open the floor to some Q&A. I know that this is a really topical issue, and Simon's just given us a really comprehensive overview of what Brexit means. And I think it's one of the things that strikes me about Brexit and UK's exposure is that the UK has been so successful at securing high levels of EU research funding, and so many of the successful applicants originally came from the EU or from outside of the UK. So I'd like to open the floor, and I think this gentleman had his hand up here. Yes, please. And we do have roving mics, and if you could just introduce yourself, that'd be great.
My name is Sanjeev Sahani from OP Jindal Global University, India. Thank you, UNSW, for organizing such a wonderful program, because we are going to talk about the whole world today. If I have heard very clearly the first three speakers and this gentleman, out of four, three mentioned about funding part. It's not a question, but it's kind of a little suggestion. If you go to the statistics, that almost in United States, the industries, they fund research grants up to the level of 70 to 80%. I don't have the exact statistics. But you come back to the developing countries, it is somewhere around 9 to 11 or 14%. Now, Indian government, almost 4 years back, they said that every industry has to pay 2% of their profit to the CSR activities, where it can go to the school education and higher education as well. So just I was thinking that the majority of the innovation, creativity, research, whatever we do in university, it basically helps the industry. Especially I'm talking about the engineering, medicine, and even to a certain extent social sciences, it helps an industry. So how we can involve these industries as a rule to pay some amount towards the research grants to the university. Thank you.
The problem of getting society and the economy to pay for the benefits of higher education is a universal problem. And in the case of industry, I mean, the temptation to free ride on the basis of a largely or partly publicly funded system is too great to set aside, I think. I mean, if you look at the United States research system, with a significant exception of biomedicine, biotech, the commercial presence in research funding is still relatively minor, and overwhelmingly research is sustained by national research system. And in that sense, the US, with its wonderful R&D development, connecting into the universities at every level, is not all that different to the East Asian systems, which are pouring money through the public sector into the development of research capacity, accelerated development of research capacity. It's difficult to make industry pay directly. What is possible, and where governments are able to get traction, of course, is in securing a more applied orientation amongst universities, because you can create a set of incentives and drivers which ensure that. And I think that's been the tendency of policy. So you've still got a sort of free rider and public good approach, but you've got a more directed, industry-focused research effort. That's been the tendency, with resulting costs to some extent on the blue sky side. So, I mean, I think it's the same with training, really, isn't it? It's, except in where you've got nested training to particular companies, it's difficult to get companies direct to fund the cost of training, because they know that if they fund substantially the cost of degrees and diplomas, then there's every chance that the graduates are not going to go to them, but they're going to go to their competitors.
Thank you. Yes, a question down the front.
Thank you, Marek van der Wende. Thank you, Simon. The numbers you presented for the top 10 universities benefiting from European research funding, I take that's million pounds sterling. Could it be useful to put them a little bit more in perspective? Could you help me with that? For instance, as a percentage of the total research income of a university, but also taking into account what the UK contributes to these funds. And of course, we know that there is a positive return on investment for the UK, but I think we should be looking at that as well. Another context could perhaps be the percentage compared to what the more regional or locally oriented universities would lose over the structural funds.
Yeah,
Could you help me
structural
with
funds are
that?
at play as well. I mean, I take the point, and a larger set of tables and graphs is needed to respond. I won't try and improvise that now, but I'm happy to talk about it later. And the Technopolis report that I've quoted from contains a lot of very good information, which gives you the breakdown of structural adjustment, compares the percentage of funding from UK government sources to European sources by institution and by discipline. So we do have that sense, but I just provided the most simple two raw tables, just to draw attention to the discipline problem as well as the institution problem, because we tend in these gatherings to focus on our institutions as sort of corporate entities. We should think about fields of knowledge and the effects that collaboration and funding of collaboration has on research in fields of knowledge. And some fields are clearly more Europeanised than others.